Have you any questions or comments on our subject tonight? How do you want to do that?
You said that us didn't agree with Wycliffe, or it was first Wycliffe. What areas did he hold out?
The main difference, and the most important difference, was the Mass. Huss, sadly, believed in transubstantiation. If he had denied transubstantiation, he would have been executed an awful lot quicker. But Huss believed in transubstantiation. It's interesting, though, we talk a wee bit about the church architecture or decor in the Bethlehem Chapel. They wrote on their walls in the Bethlehem Chapel. Huss would put some of his theology and have it painted on the walls. And one of the 6 inscriptions on the walls of the Bethlehem Chapel, it's called like the 6 errors, concerned the Mass. And Huss opposed this view of the Mass, that the priest creates the body of Christ. The Roman Catholics, they were arguing, this improves Huss's view a little bit, but they were arguing not only does God work a miracle, but really the priest works a miracle, and therefore the priest ought to be set in a very high pedestal, and it really doesn't matter how much he doesn't know or how ungodly he lives. And Huss at least saw through that the priest oughtn't take any credit for it. But he did believe in transubstantiation, and he was wrong. A second improvement he made in that area was that he said the cup ought to be given to the laity, the people of God. I don't like laity, clergy, but when you're dealing with the 15th century, the words capture the ideas better at that time. So there were a couple, but he was wrong on that. Yeah. And then you have to remember the darkness of the days and the power and oppression of the Roman Church. They had difficulty proving Huss a heretic, and they had to make up charges and falsify what he was saying. But as of 1215, transubstantiation was an established dogma. And if you deny that in front of the wrong person, you could be dead very, very quickly. Not that Huss was a coward or anything like that. He just didn't have as much light in that regard. We mentioned the comparison with Luther on justification by faith alone. Huss wasn't as clear in that. Neither was Wycliffe. It's part of the development of doctrine. It takes time for people to shake themselves free of errors. Perhaps, if you're not so historically minded, you can think back to some things in your own life, even after you were converted, when you believed things that today you look back on and you shake your head and think, how in all the world could I have prayed to speak in tongues? Or how could I have been a dispensationalist? Or I used to believe in free will. But God teaches you. And it happens something like that in church history too. Yeah. Julian?
Do we know exactly what he was charged with?
We do indeed. We have the charges against Jan Hus in English. Here's the first one. Isn't this beautiful? Condemned articles of John Huss. 1. There is one only holy universal church, which is the total number of those predestined to salvation. Burn him! Burn him! It therefore follows that the universal holy church is only one, inasmuch as there is one only number of all who are predestined to salvation. Here's part of number 3. The foreknown are as damned are not parts of the church, for no part of the church can finally fall away from it, since the predestinating love that binds the church together does not fail. They should be worshipping at this point, but they're going to burn him for it. Huss says it, according to their summary in number 6, the church is an article of faith in the following sense: to regard it as the convocation of those predestined to salvation. And here's one. Number 11. It is not necessary to believe that any particular Roman pontiff is the head of any particular holy church unless God has predestined him to salvation. Number 21. The grace of predestination is the bond whereby the body of the church and each of its members is indissolubly joined with the head. Great articles. And they also mention Judas Iscariot in many of these articles, because Huss mentioned Judas Iscariot. And Huss said, if somebody's faithful and preaches the word, he's a follower of Peter. If he imitates his virtues and his work. But if he doesn't, he's an imitator of another one of the apostles, Judas Iscariot. And it really stuck in the craw of the Council of Constance, and they keep mentioning this about Judas Iscariot. Strangely, here's number 4, a very short one. Condemned articles of John Huss. The two natures, the divinity and the humanity, are one Christ. But that's orthodox creedal doctrine, even according to the Church of Rome. I think Homer must, in fact the whole council of Homers, must have nodded and fallen fast asleep at the council of that one. The two natures, the divinity and the humanity, are one Christ. I think God sent upon them, as Romans 11, quoting Psalm 69, says, God sent upon them the spirit of stupor. Spirit of stupor.
How many charges?
There were 30 charges. 30 charges. It's interesting, they tried to get Huss at various points with 45 charges that they levelled against Wycliffe. And then they said, well, you're a follower of him, so we can get you in these charges too. Now, interestingly, amongst the charges made against Martin Luther in the papal bull Ex Urge Domini that went up in flames in Wittenberg, charge number 30, I think it was, said that Luther is a heretic, is excommunicated, and ought to die because he agrees with Jan Hus. And then the preface to that keeps linking Luther with Wycliffe and Huss and the Hussites. Just as the condemnation of Jan Hus in his papal bull, or in the Declaration of the Council of Constance, keeps linking him with Wycliffe. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because we have a whole lot of really liberal and trendy theologians, and they say, well, you know, there's not much of a connection between Wycliffe and the Reformation, and there's no much of a connection between Huss and the Reformation, and pre-reformers, we don't want any of that stuff. But even the Church of Rome recognized they were teaching the same things. Any other thoughts or comments?
On what ground did the enemies of Huss come to the conclusion that he was holding to ecumenical attendance?
Part of it is that Huss wasn't as sharply clear in things. And another part of it is the ecumenists and the Church of Rome, I'll cut to the quick break, they don't think like you or I. They just don't. Here's an article containing a speech by Pope Francis, and he's speaking to some ecumenical Czechs who were at the Vatican in June of this year, and he talks about the fact that Jan Hus died tragically. Died tragically. I mean, you're the head of that rotten church that burned him at the stake. Died tragically. It reminds you what some of the spokesmen of the IRA said. You know, it's regrettable. It's very regrettable that these people were shot. Yeah, but you and your organisation shot them. That's regrettable. Won't you condemn it? Well, have condemned it. I haven't told you how much clearer can I get. It's regrettable. It's sad that it had to happen. Now, this is what the Pope's saying here. They number, according to Francis, they number Jan Hus among the reformers of the church. Yeah, which church? Which reformers? And then they talk about Jan Hus today as a reason for dialogue. Huh? And then Pope Francis goes on to say that Hus is another argument for, quote, the visible communion among Christians. They're actually using Hus for false ecumenism. And when they mean visible communion among Christians, you know what they mean. Join us, the Church of Rome, because the church is primarily visible. And it's our institution and not yours. So you really should shape up and join us. And then he says at the end, we need to forgive one another. Some apology there. We need to forgive one another. And Huss points us to the path of reconciliation and peace. And there's one scripture quoted in the article. John 17, verse 21. That they all may be one. Which passes about spiritual unity in according to the work of Christ on the cross, and his prayers, when he doesn't pray for the world, he prays only for those of God have given him the election, that the elect may be kept and sanctified and united and glorified. And then the Pope has the gall to quote that about a man whom he and his rotten church burned at the stake. Disgusts me. Disgusts me. Any other thoughts? Or there's somebody going to ask around the same time as Bobby? It's like, Jimmy?
Is there a connection with John Huss and the Moravians today?
There is.
Is there a connection somewhere?
Yes. From Huss we go to the Hussites, and then the Hussites broke into various groups, and then the Hussites actually had crusades declared against them. The only crusades you ever hear about today are the crusades that the medieval church and its folly called against the Muslims. There were other crusades. There was crusades against the Albigenses in the south of France, and there were about 5 crusades against the Hussites in Bohemia, one of which was led by a cleric from England, of all things. And the Hussites beat them. They beat them. And they were led by a one-eyed general, Jan Žižka. Mary and I, when we were in the Czech Republic a few years ago, went to the key sites, and we noticed, looking at these paintings of Jan Žižka, that he had an eye patch on. And obviously the records didn't indicate which eye, because in one picture it's the right and the other one is the left eye. But so they splintered among themselves, and then some of them went what you would really call more Anabaptist. And then they moved more, well, think of the old Czechoslovakia. You have Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia, and Moravia, the sort of middle bit. The more Anabaptist ones moved up there. It's a bit more complicated to explain historically, so I'll just say that. And then they, in turn, became the Moravians, and Count Zinzendorf organised them and so forth. And then people came in from surrounding lands. And then, of course, the Moravians influenced John Wesley. So you have a connection there. But Huss said many really good things against predestination, and I've got a great quote I could read you. It's very long, so I won't. But suffice to say that Huss believed that the church was the company of the predestinate, and Huss and Wesley believed that the church was the body of those who use their free will aright. So we can't blame Jan Hus for the teachings of John Wesley. Yeah.
A bit off topic, is it that the Catholic Church only takes they don't give the wine to the congregation, you just share it on the priests?
Yeah, that goes back to transubstantiation, because it's easier. Well, transubstantiation affects both elements, the bread and the wine. It affects the bread, so that in Roman Catholic Eucharist, you don't actually get bread. You get a wafer, because a bread can crumble. And if this really is the body, blood, and divinity of Christ, then a mouse could come in and eat it. You couldn't have that. And then the wine, if you've got a congregation, say 100 people, probably one person's maybe older and got a bit jittery in the hand or something like that. These things can happen. Spilled some. So the false doctrine of transubstantiation then led to this other error of denying the cup to the people. And then, of course, the priest, people come down and bow before him, and then you get more idolatry. And then you have people crossing themselves because of the consecrated host in the building. That's a good point. Yeah. Maybe more light was dawning in it in that dark, smelly cell. Yeah. By the way, I want to point out that Huss was not the only Bohemian martyr. And he wasn't even the first. There were 3 young men, Martin, John, and Stasek, who also protested the preaching of indulgences by the Roman Church. They were then imprisoned in the old town hall. Huss came and said, "This is terrible. You shouldn't be doing this to these men," and got assurance from them that they wouldn't be badly treated. And he hadn't left that long before they cut their heads off. Then their bodies were carried to the Bethlehem Chapel, and they had a funeral service led by Huss and the men were interred. And I should complete the story by jumping ahead a year after Huss's execution to the martyrdom of Jerome of Prague, the man you'll remember who was responsible in large part for bringing Wycliffe's ideas and books to Prague. He was burned at the stake by that same Holy Ecumenical Council in 1416. And he was an incredibly learned and eloquent man. And the council that had burned Huss a year before were almost convinced by him, the authorities say. Almost convinced by him. That must have been some speech. But they weren't convinced, and they burned him at the stake. And it's interesting too how that sort of ability sometimes can be the reason for you being executed more quickly, or it can be the reason for your getting away with it a bit longer. I was intrigued to read recently that, going back to John Wycliffe, that at that time Oxford was ranked higher than Paris. In the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, it was generally Paris, but Oxford was ranked more higher. And then Wycliffe was reckoned to be the top theologian and thinker, at least according to this book, of them all. And when you're the top thinker and theologian at the top university in Europe, there's a sense in which you can get away with a few more things that the ordinary man can't. Although there's also a sense in which you're especially dangerous. I'm on a dearly beloved subject to myself, and I could go on a bit further, but you also need a cup of tea, and maybe it's getting a bit stuffy, so shall we call the day at that? Refreshments out the back and to the left, and there's lots of free pamphlets, and you're very welcome to them. So thank you. Class dismissed. That's what our teacher used to say anyway.